The backstage area of the Starrise studio was a special kind of chaos. It smelled like hairspray, coffee, and nervous sweat. People in sparkly costumes twirled in corners, their faces set in fierce, focused expressions. A teenager tuned a violin over and over, the same sharp note cutting through the murmur of voices. Another group chanted harmonies, their hands clasped together. In the middle of it all, leaning against a cool concrete wall, was a young woman who seemed like she'd wandered into the wrong building. She wore a simple dress with small blue flowers on it, the kind you might wear to a Sunday lunch at a relative's house. Her dark hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. In her hands, which were damp and cold, she clutched the worn strap of a canvas tote bag. Inside that bag was her life, or at least the part that mattered most: a folder of well-loved sheet music, a bottle of water, and a photo of her grandfather. Her name was Maria Varga. She was 19 years old, and she worked as a receptionist at her uncle's auto repair shop in a town that was mostly known for its clock factory. Her world was one of grease-stained invoices, the smell of motor oil, and the constant, friendly clang of tools from the garage bay. Her fingers, which now felt stiff and clumsy, were more used to typing out work orders and handing back car keys than touching the keys of a grand piano. The piano she knew was an old upright that lived in the front room of her mother's house. Her grandfather had rescued it from a school that was throwing it out. For months he had worked on it in his shed, replacing the felt on the hammers, carefully tightening the strings, polishing the scratched walnut wood until it glowed with a soft, deep light. He had given it to her for her 10th birthday. "Every home needs music, kicks him," he'd said in his rough, warm voice. "You will learn." But there was no money for lessons. So she learned the way a bird learns to fly by trying. She found old books of music at the library. She watched countless videos online, pausing and rewinding, her eyes glued to the shapes of hands on keyboards. She listened to records her grandfather left behind, not just classical, but folk songs, jazz, strange experimental things he'd picked up from who knows where. The piano became her friend, her diary, her escape. She'd come home from school, or later from the auto shop, her mind full of the day's noise, and she'd sit on the worn bench. At first, she played the simple tunes from the books, but soon the music inside her head didn't match the notes on the page. She started to change them, to add her own low, rumbling chords in the left hand, to make the right hand run faster, and in patterns she didn't have names for. The old upright shook with the sound. Her mother would shout from the kitchen, "Marika, the neighbors!" But she'd be smiling when she said it. The decision to send a tape to Starrise was a joke at first. Her friends from work did it one slow afternoon, filming her on a phone as she played a sweet, pretty version of a folk song. She was looking down, her hair falling forward, completely lost in the simple melody. They sent it in without really telling her, laughing about how she could be famous and get them all backstage passes. She'd forgotten about it. Then the email came. She'd been chosen for a live audition in the city. The producers who called her were nice, but they had a certain way of talking. "We love your story, Maria," one of them, a woman with a cheerful voice, had said. The self-taught pianist from the little town, the grandfather's piano. "It's very authentic. For the audition, we think you should play something accessible, you know, something the audience can hum along to. Stick to that lovely, simple style. It's who you are." Maria had held the phone to her ear, looking out the window at the rain. She thought about the storm of sound she could unleash on the old upright, the music that felt like her own heartbeat. But the woman's voice was so sure. These people were professionals. They knew what worked on television. "Yes," Maria had said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "A simple tune. I understand." Now, standing in the wings, She wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The scale of everything was overwhelming. The stage was huge, a vast plain of polished wood, under lights so hot and bright they looked like they could melt you. The audience was a dark, murmuring sea beyond it. And the judges. She'd seen them on TV. Lucas, the one who always said the cruel thing that made everyone gasp. Simone, the beautiful pop star with the voice of an angel. David, the rock legend with the leather jackets and the wild laugh. Chloe, from the musicals, who could belt a note that shattered glass. They were like gods on their high chairs, and they were tired. She could see it from where she stood. They'd been listening to people all day, and their patience was a thin, fraying thread. A production assistant with a headset hurried past, talking into a microphone. Next up is the piano girl, the one with the grandpa's story. Cue the heartfelt intro package. He gave Maria a quick, impersonal thumbs up. You're on after this break. Just be sweet, yeah? Play your little song. Little song. The word sat in her stomach like a stone. She closed her eyes and put her hand inside her tote bag. Her fingers didn't go to the sheet music. They found the photograph tucked in the side pocket. It was black and white, a bit faded. Her grandfather was standing next to the freshly restored piano, his big carpenter's hand resting on its top. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at the piano with a kind of proud, quiet joy. He believed the instrument had a soul waiting to be sung. He believed she could sing it. For years she had played for an audience of one his memory in that quiet front room. The music she made, there was big and wild and true. It was her. The buzzer for the end of the commercial break sounded, a sharp electric shock in the air. The assistant pointed at her. Go, now, walk to the mark. Maria's legs felt like they were made of wood. She blinked in the sudden darkness of the wing, then stepped forward into the blinding wall of light. The sound of the audience was a wave that hit her physically. She couldn't see a single face, just a black void. She walked to the small, glowing X of tape on the floor, the prescribed spot for contestants to stand and be examined. She clutched her tote bag in front of her like a shield. And what is your name, dear? Chloe asked, her voice kind but distant, the way you'd speak to a child. Maria's mouth was dry. She gave her name, her town. Her voice sounded small and tinny in the giant room. She explained about her grandfather, about teaching herself. She saw Lucas, the music exec, glance down at his paper, his pen poised. He'd already decided, she thought. He's writing no before I even play. And what will you be playing for us today? Simone asked, leaning forward with a polite, encouraging smile. This was the moment. The producer's voice was in her head. Asterisk something accessible. Something sweet. A simple tune. Asterisk it was the safe thing. The expected thing. It was what they had all signed up for. Maria looked from the judges' expectant faces to the giant, sleek, black grand piano waiting for her under its own soft spotlight. It was nothing like her old, rumbling upright. This was a beast made for concert halls. An instrument for real musicians. She took a breath that shuddered in her chest. It is. A variation, she said, the words coming out stronger than she expected. On a familiar theme. She saw David the rocker nod slowly, as if to say, asterisk, all right, get on with it. Asterisk, without another word, she turned her back on the judges and walked toward the piano. Her simple flowered dress seemed to glow against the piano's profound black. Every step felt heavy, but with each one, the noise of the studio, the pressure, the expectations, began to fade. There was only her, the bench, and the keys. She sat down. The stool was cold and hard. She adjusted it slightly, a familiar ritual. She laid her cold, damp hands on the keys, feeling their perfect, cool smoothness. For a second, she was frozen. The silence in the studio was absolute. waiting to be filled. And in her mind, she saw the photograph. She saw her grandfather's hand on the wood. She heard not the producer's voice, but the music that lived in her, the storm, the joy, the sorrow, the truth of it. It was not a simple tune. It was a universe. She took a deep, deep breath, her shoulders settling. Her fingers, which had felt like strangers, curled, finding their home. She was ready. The walk from the bright X on the floor to the piano felt like the longest journey of her life. The studio lights, which from the wings had looked hot, now felt like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders and the top of her head. She was aware of every rustle in the silent audience, every tiny cough. Her flowered dress, which had felt fine at home, now seemed childish under this brutal glare. She reached the piano. It was a monstrous, beautiful thing, all polished black curves and gold lettering. It looked less like an instrument and more like a sleeping predator. Her own piano at home had scratches on its sides from where she'd bumped it with a vacuum cleaner. This one was perfect, and it terrified her. She sat on the bench. It was too high. She'd never played on a bench that adjusted with a twist knob. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through her. She fumbled underneath, her fingers clumsy, and gave the knob a frantic turn. It lowered with a sudden, loud clunk that echoed in the quiet. Someone in the audience let out a small, stifled laugh. Her cheeks burned. From the judge's table, she heard a faint, weary sigh. She didn't look, but she knew it came from the music executive, Lucas. She could picture him rubbing his temples. Asterisk another one who doesn't even know how to sit, he'd be thinking. Finally settled, she placed her tote bag carefully on the floor. Her hands, now shaking visibly, hovered above the keys. They looked pale and small against the vast expanse of black and white. These weren't the familiar, slightly yellowed keys of her grandfather's upright. These were pristine, like teeth in a movie star's smile. For a horrible second, her mind went blank. The simple folk tune she was supposed to play, the accessible one, vanished from her memory completely. All that was left was a roaring white noise of fear. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to block it all out. This was a mistake. She should get up, mutter an apology, and walk off. They'd put it in one of those funny montage shows, the girl who was so nervous she forgot how to play. Her friends at the auto shop would see it and feel bad for her. Her mother would hug her and say it was brave just to try. But then, behind her closed eyelids, she didn't see the studio. She saw the front room of her mother's house. The rain was tapping against the window. The lamp by the piano was the only light on, casting a warm orange pool over the music stand. She could almost smell the old wood and the faint, sweet scent of the polish her grandfather used. She could feel the give of the well-worn pedal under her socked foot. The music wasn't in the shiny piano or the watching judges. It was in her. It was in the memory of her grandfather's hands, rough from work, showing her a chord. It was in the long, quiet nights where the only sound was the music growing under her fingers, becoming something bigger than herself. The producer's words, simple, sweet, accessible, they were like a too small coat she'd been trying to squeeze into. It was time to take it off. Her breathing slowed. The shaking in her hands didn't stop, but it changed. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was energy, a current waiting to be grounded. She opened her eyes. She looked at her hands, and they were just her hands. The hands that typed invoices and made tea. The hands that could make her old piano sing and shout. She placed her fingers on the cool keys. She didn't think about the judges, the millions of people who might be watching at home. She thought about the first note, just the first one, and she began. The opening was exactly what everyone expected. It was the old, sad, beautiful melody of Danny Boy. Her right hand picked out the tune, clear and clean, but with a fragile, lonely tenderness. The notes hung in the air, simple and pure. She played it straight, just as she'd been told. In the judge's booth, the posture was one of polite attention. Simone, the pop star, gave a small, appreciative nod. It was pretty. It was sweet. It was exactly the heartwarming underdog moment the producers had planned. Chloe, the musical theater star, felt a pang of nostalgia. The tune reminded her of her own Irish grandmother. She softened, ready to give a gentle yes to this shy girl. David, the rock legend, listened with his head tilted. It was competent, he thought. Nice enough. But he'd heard 1,000 versions of it. His mind was already drifting to what he might have for dinner after the long taping out Lucas. The executive finally looked up from his notepad. He scribbled a single word, sentimental. He drew a small box around it. It was fine. It was safe television. He'd give her a yes to be kind, but she wouldn't last past the next round. There was no edge, no surprise. Maria played the first full phrase of the melody, her left hand adding the most basic, respectful chords. It was like watching someone carefully trace a drawing they'd done 100 times before. Then, something shifted Dot as the last note of that first phrase faded. She didn't lift her hands. Instead, she leaned her whole body into the piano. It was a subtle movement, but it was a musician's movement. Her back straightened, her shoulders dropped, and a focused intensity settled over her that was visible even from a distance. She repeated the first 4 notes of the melody, then again, and again. But this time, her left hand came down not with a chord, but with a deep, low, rumbling cluster of notes, a sound that was less like music and more like the earth groaning. The sweet folk tune was still there in the right hand, but now it was being pinned down by something dark and powerful. David's drifting eyes snapped back to the stage. He leaned forward an inch. Maria's right hand broke free of the melody. It started to run, not with pretty little trills, but with fast, insistent, repetitive patterns. The notes were sharp and clear, like rain on a tin roof, but they formed a complex, driving rhythm that was utterly modern, utterly unexpected. The simple tune had been a seed, and now, before their ears, it was exploding into a wild, pulsing vine. Lucas's pen stopped dead on the paper. The word sentimental was now irrelevant. His eyebrows climbed his forehead. What was this? This wasn't in the script. She built the pattern, layer upon layer. Her left hand began to pound out a rhythm that was almost tribal, a deep, resonant heartbeat against the glittering rain of notes from her right. The sound filled the studio, not with pretty sweetness, but with raw, thrilling power. It was melancholic, but also furious. It was technical, but overflowing with feeling. It was as if she had been holding her breath for years and was finally letting it out in one magnificent, controlled hurricane of sound. Simone's polite smile had vanished. Her mouth was slightly open. She wasn't hearing a contestant anymore. She was hearing an artist. Her professional ear recognized the insane difficulty of what was being played, the independence of the hands, the relentless pace, the dynamic control, but it was the emotion that stunned her. This was a story, a painful, beautiful story told in a language of keys and chords she'd never heard spoken quite. This way Chloe had brought her hands to her chest. Tears, genuine ones, welled in her eyes. This was no longer just a tune about missing someone. This was the sound of missing someone. The sound of memory, sharp and sweet and aching. The theatricality of it, the sheer dramatic force, hit her in the heart. And David was now perched on the very edge of his seat, his forearms on the judge's table. A huge disbelieving grin was spreading across his face. This was rock and roll, not in the guitars and drums, but in the spirit. It was rebellious. It was taking something old and smashing it to build something new and breathtaking. He wanted to stand up and cheer in the middle of it. On stage, Maria was gone. The shy girl in the flowered dress had disappeared. In her place was a force of nature. Her body moved with the music, not in big, showy gestures, but with a total physical commitment. She was inside the storm she was creating. Her face was a mask of concentration and release, pain and joy all mixed together. She was playing the grand piano as if she were wrestling it, as if she were climbing it, as if she were pouring every lonely hour of practice. Every dream she thought was silly, every ounce of love for the man who gave her the music, directly into its strings. The piece built and built. A tidal wave of sound that seemed impossible to come from one person and one instrument. It wasn't just impressive. It was transformative. The very air in the studio seemed to change, charged with electricity. The audience was utterly still, not a rustle, not a cough. They were holding their collective breath, caught in the spell of a girl who was no longer playing a simple tune, but was finally, completely, speaking in her true voice. The storm of sound wasn't loud in a crashing, angry way. It was loud in the way a heartbeat is loud when you press your ear to someone's chest. It was a sound that filled up all the empty spaces in the huge studio, pushing back the bright, clinical light and replacing it with something shadowed and real. Maria's hands were a blur, but not a frantic one. They moved with a shocking certainty. Her left hand wasn't just playing bass notes anymore. It was creating landscapes. Deep, rumbling clusters of notes rolled like distant thunder. Then it would shift, picking out a stark, repeating pattern that felt like footsteps on a cold road. It was the backbone. The earth beneath everything got her right hand was the sky. It poured down showers of high, glittering notes, run so fast they seemed to melt together into a single shimmering curtain of sound. But inside that shower, like ghosts, the original folk melody would reappear. You'd catch a familiar fragment of Danny Boy, but it was twisted, stretched, wrapped in these new, complex rhythms. It was like hearing a memory trying to break through the noise of the present. She wasn't just playing notes from memory. She was building the music right there, in front of them. You could see her listening, her head cocked slightly, as if she was hearing the next step a second before her fingers found it. She'd lean into a phrase, her whole body urging the piano to give her more, and then pull back, letting a single, clear note hang alone in the sudden quiet, aching and a beautiful dot the camera, almost by its own will, drifted away from her face and found the judges. The pop star, Simone, had one perfectly manicured hand pressed to her lips. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. She had built a career on control, on hitting every note with pristine accuracy. What she was witnessing was different. This was controlled chaos. This was technique completely enslaved to feeling. She saw the girl's fingers flying, and her own singer's mind balked at the impossible physicality of it. But it was the raw vulnerability that got her. This wasn't a performance designed to please them. This was a confession. A young woman was tearing her heart out and using the piano strings to stitch the sound of it together. Simone felt a lump form in her own throat. She was watching someone cross the line from being a person who plays music to a person who is in music. If only for these few minutes. Next to her, the theater star Chloe had tears tracking quietly through her makeup. She was a storyteller. She knew about building a scene, about taking an audience on a journey. This was a journey. The simple beginning was the first act, the quiet, ordinary world. Then came the inciting incident, the moment the melody fractured, and now they were deep in the second act, the transformation, the struggle. She could see the story. A girl missing her grandfather. A girl feeling out of place. A girl whose inner world was so much bigger and more turbulent than anyone could guess. The music was her monologue. It was more powerful than any words could ever be. Chloe's hands were clasped so tightly together, her knuckles were white. She was feeling it all, viscerally, in her performer's soul. The rock legend, David, had abandoned any pretense of cool judgment. He was hunched forward, elbows on the table, his chin resting on his fists. His eyes were narrowed, not in criticism, but in fierce concentration. He was tracing the rhythms, his head giving the tiniest of nods. This had the guts of great rock and roll. It wasn't safe. It was a risk. It was all feeling, channeled through insane skill. He'd seen guitarists lose themselves in a solo like this, but a piano? A young woman on a TV talent show? It was blowing his mind. A grin kept trying to break through his focused expression. This was the stuff he lived for the moment, when someone forgets the rules and just goes for it. She wasn't playing for votes. She was playing for her life. And Lucas, the music executive, the man who had heard it all, who had built a career on knowing what would sell. His pen lay forgotten on the blank notepad. His face was a blank slate of pure shock. Every assumption he had made in the last 5 minutes had been vaporized. The sweet, simple tune was a distant memory. The heartwarming grandpa story now felt like a profound understatement. This wasn't just a good performance. This was a style. It was a sound. He wasn't just listening to a contestant. He was listening to a potential album, to a concert hall tour, to a whole new lane in the industry that he hadn't even seen coming. His mind, always calculating, was racing. Who did she sound like? No one. That was the terrifying, brilliant thing. She sounded like herself. In a business built on comparisons, he had nothing to compare this to. He just stared, his professional cynicism completely disarmed. Back on stage, Maria was approaching a peak. The music became denser, louder, a roaring cataract of notes. She was using the entire piano now, from the deepest, growling bass to the highest bell-like tones at the top. Her foot on the sustain pedal was a constant, subtle pulse, blending the chaos into a roaring, beautiful wave. It felt like it couldn't possibly get any more intense, like the piano itself would splinter under the force. And then she began the climb down. It wasn't an abrupt stop. It was a careful, heartbreaking unraveling. She started to strip the layers away. The roaring left hand softened to a murmur. The glittering rain from the right hand became a gentle drizzle. The fragments of the original melody came back more frequently, clearer now, but changed. They were sadder, wiser, laced with all the complexity that had just poured out. The anger was gone. The storm had passed. What was left was a deep, resonant ache. The music became spacious, lonely. Single notes echoed into the silence, followed by quiet, questioning chords. It was the sound of exhaustion after tears, the sound of a memory cherished, turned over in the hands, and finally, gently, put back on the shelf. Her body, which had been taut with energy, now seemed to settle, to grow heavy. The final minute was almost painfully quiet. Just a few spare notes echoing in the vast studio. She played the very first phrase of Danny Boy once more, but now it was slower, fractured. Played with a tenderness that was almost too private to watch. Her hands lifted from the keys and came to rest in her lap. The last note vibrated in the air, a physical thing that seemed to hang there, slowly fading into nothing. Silence. It was a complete, total, and profound silence. The kind of silence that is louder than any applause. It was the sound of hundreds of people forgetting to breathe. Maria sat perfectly still, her head bowed, looking at her hands in her lap. She was back. The storm was over. The girl in the flowered dress had returned, but she was not the same. She felt hollowed out and peaceful, like she'd just told a secret she'd been carrying for years. In the audience, not a single person moved. No one clapped. They were all suspended in the feeling she had created. It would take them a second to remember where they were at the judges' table. The four of them were statues. Lucas was still staring, his mouth slightly open. Simone had both hands over her heart now, as if trying to steady it. Chloe was using a tissue to carefully dab under her eyes, trying not to smudge her makeup, but not really caring. David slowly leaned back in his chair, letting out a long, slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He ran a hand through his hair, a look of sheer disbelief on his face. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2, 3, 4. It was broken by a single thunderous sound. It was David. He wasn't one for waiting. He brought his two hands together in one explosive, percussive clap. Crack. It was like a gunshot in the quiet room. It broke the spell, and then the room erupted. The single, thunderous clap from the rock legend was the crack that shattered a dam. It wasn't polite applause. It was a release of pure, pent-up energy. The audience, as if waking from a collective dream, erupted. The sound that filled the studio wasn't just clapping. It was a roar. People were on their feet, shouting, whistling, their faces alight with the shock and thrill of what they'd just witnessed. The wave of noise hit Maria like a physical force, washing over the piano and soaking into her skin. She flinched, her head coming up sharply. For a few seconds, she looked genuinely bewildered, as if she'd forgotten they were there. The noise was so different from the intimate, all-consuming world of the music. This was the outside world crashing back in. She blinked, her eyes finding the bright lights, the dark shapes of people standing and cheering. A slow, dawning realization crept over her face. They weren't booing. They were, for her? Her hands, which had felt so powerful and sure moments ago, now trembled again in her lap. She looked down at them, then back at the roaring crowd, a shy, almost frightened smile touching her lips. She didn't know what to do, so she did the only thing that felt right. She turned on the piano bench, her movements stiff and awkward again, and faced the judges. The four of them were a picture of stunned recovery. David was still clapping, a broad, triumphant grin on his face, nodding his head at her as if to say, "Yes, that's it." Chloe was dabbing her eyes more firmly now, smiling through the tears, her applause soft and steady. Simone had her hands clasped under her chin, her eyes shining as she looked at Maria with something like awe. And Lucas, the executive, had finally closed his mouth. He was applauding too, a slow, deliberate clap, his eyes never leaving her face. He looked like a man who had just seen a map to a hidden treasure. The host, a man with a bright smile and a crisp suit, had to come out and gesture for quiet. It took nearly a full minute for the noise to die down to an excited, buzzing hum. People slowly sank back into their seats, but the energy in the room was electric, crackling. "Wow," the host said, his voice full of genuine amazement. He looked at Maria, just, "Wow. Maria, come over here, please." She stood up. Her legs felt like jelly. She walked the few steps to the center stage mark, her steps small and unsteady. The contrast between the commanding figure at the piano and this shy young woman was almost jarring. She clutched her hands in front of her flowered dress, looking impossibly young. The host turned to the judges. "I don't even know where to start. Lucas, you look like you've seen a ghost." Lucas picked up his microphone slowly. He didn't speak for a moment, just looked at Maria, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. When he finally spoke, his usual slick, confident tone was gone. His voice was quieter, almost rough. "I have to be honest with you," he began, and the room went silent again, waiting for the famous sharp critique. "I thought I knew what was coming. I heard the story, the grandfather, the self-taught thing, the simple tune." He paused, shaking his head. "I wrote you off before you even played a note. I thought, sweet girl, nice story, not for this competition. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. What you just did. I have been in this business for 25 years. I have listened to thousands of pianists. Classical, jazz, pop. I have never, ever heard anything like that. It wasn't just playing. It was architecture. You built a city of sound out of a few simple notes. And you tore it down right in front of us. He ran a hand over his face. I was wrong. Spectacularly, completely wrong. And I am rarely wrong. A small, genuine smile broke through. That was a masterclass. Not in technique, though my God, the technique, but in emotional communication. You didn't perform for us. You opened a door and let us look inside. That is a gift I cannot quantify. Maria just stared at him, her eyes wide. She gave a small, uncertain nod, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to accept the words. The host turned to Simone next. The pop star took a deep breath, composing herself. Her voice, when it came, was warm and full of emotion. Honey, she said, and the word was so kind it made Maria's eyes well up. Where did that come from? Up there? That person at the piano? She gestured toward the instrument. I am a singer. My whole life is about finding the truth in a lyric, in a melody. What you just did? You told an entire novel without a single word. I felt every second of it. I felt the loneliness, the anger, the love, the peace. All of it? She shook her head, her own voice catching. When you started, I thought, what a lovely, fragile sound. And then you just exploded. You took your fragility and you turned it into strength. You turned it into power. That is the most beautiful thing an artist can do. I am so moved, truly. Before Maria could even process that, David jumped in, not waiting for his turn. He grabbed his mic. Hold on, he said, his voice booming with its usual rock and roll energy, but there was a new respect in it. Let's talk about the guts of that. That was punk rock on a grand piano. You know what I loved? I loved that you tricked us. You gave us the lullaby, and then you punched us in the heart with it. He laughed, a loud, joyful sound. That rhythm you built in the left hand? That was like a freight train. And the right hand? It was like watching a firework display in a rainstorm. Brilliant. I don't care about the proper way to play anything. There is no proper after that. You just made your own way. That's what music is for. He pointed a finger at her, his grin fierce. You're not a contestant. You're a revolutionary with a piano bench. I haven't been this excited by a new artist in a decade. Finally, it was Chloe's turn. Her voice was softer, still thick with feeling. My dear girl, she said, and it sounded like an endearment from a favorite aunt. I have performed on stages for 30 years. I know about creating a moment. What you created there. That was one of the most complete, most devastatingly perfect theatrical moments I have ever experienced. You had a beginning, a middle, and an end. You took us on a journey. I saw the whole story. I saw your grandfather. I saw you missing him. I saw you fighting with that missing, and I saw you finally making peace with it through that beautiful, quiet ending. She pressed a hand to her chest. You made me remember people I've lost. You made me feel it all over again, and then you made it beautiful. That is not entertainment. That is art, and it is very, very rare. The host let the weight of their words hang in the air. He then turned to Maria, who was now openly crying, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. She wiped at them clumsily with the back of her hand. Maria, the host said gently, what do you have to say? What was that? She lifted the microphone to her lips. Her voice, when it came out, was a whisper, choked with tears. The sound engineer quickly turned her volume up. I was just playing, she said, and it was so simple, so honest, that the audience let out a collective sigh. The first bit. That was for my granddad. That was his favorite. He used to hum it while he worked. She took a shaky breath. But the rest, that was just the music that is always in my head. When I'm doing the invoices at the shop, when I'm on the bus, it's always there. I never had a piano that could say it all back to me before. She looked over at the grand piano, a look of gratitude on her face. Tonight I did. The silence that followed was full of warmth. All right, the host said, his own eyes looking a bit misty. Judges, you know what comes next. For Maria's audition on Star Rise. What is your decision? There was no suspense. No drawn-out drama. All 4 judges spoke at once. Yes. 1,000 times yes. Absolutely yes. The easiest yes of my life. The golden YES graphics flashed on the screen behind them. The audience roared all over again. Maria's hands flew to her mouth. Her shoulders shook as a sob of pure relief and joy escaped her. She bent forward for a second, overwhelmed, then stood up straight, nodding and crying and smiling all at once. She looked back at the judges, at the cheering audience, and then, as if drawn by a magnet, her eyes went to the piano one last time. She had come to play a simple tune. She had left a piece of her soul on that stage, and in doing so, she had changed everything. The quiet girl from the auto shop was gone. In her place stood an artist, finally seen. The walk off the stage was a blur of light and noise. A production assistant with a kind face gently guided her by the elbow, leading her through a dark corridor and into a small, quiet room they called the Golden Room. It was where the successful contestants went. There were a few others already there. A young man with a guitar, a teenage dance duo, hugging each other and crying. But when Maria entered, they all stopped and stared. Their expressions weren't of jealousy, but of pure respect. The guitarist simply nodded at her, a silent salute from one musician to another. Maria sank into a plush sofa, her body suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving her trembling and hollow. Someone handed her a bottle of water. The cold plastic felt strange in her hand. She tried to unscrew the cap, but her fingers were useless, slippery, and weak. The dance duo's girl, with a sweet smile, took it from her, opened it, and handed it back. That was incredible, the girl whispered. Just, wow. Maria tried to say thank you, but only a small squeak came out. She drank the water, the coldness shocking her system. The noise from the studio was a distant rumble through the walls. She could still feel the vibration of the piano in her bones, hear the final fading note in the silent chamber of her mind. The door opened, and the host popped his head in. Maria? The judges would like a quick word with you before they wrap up. Just you. Come with me. A fresh bolt of nerves shot through her. Were they going to take it back? Had they changed their minds? She stood up, her legs unsteady, and followed him back into the maze of corridors, not to the main stage, but to the side of the judge's desk. The audience was filing out, their excited chatter filling the air. The judges were still in their seats, looking tired but buzzing with a strange energy dot as she approached. They all turned to her. The rock legend, David, was the first to speak. He stood up and, to her shock, reached out and pulled her into a quick, firm hug. He smelled like leather and coffee. You, he said, releasing her and holding her by the shoulders, are a force of nature. Don't you ever let anyone tell you to play it simple again. You hear me? That sound in your head? That's the one we want. Simone reached over and took her hand. Her touch was cool and soft. I meant every word, she said, her eyes searching Maria's. "You have something very special. It's raw, and it's real. Protect that. Don't let this." She waved a hand at the lights and cameras. "Smooth out your rough edges. Those edges are where the magic is." Chloe simply clasped Maria's other hand. "Your grandfather," she said softly. "He was with you tonight. We all felt him. What a beautiful legacy." Finally, she turned to Lucas. He hadn't said anything yet. He just looked at her, his earlier shock replaced by a sharp, thoughtful intensity. He gestured for her to sit in a chair they'd pulled over. "Maria," he began, his voice low and serious. "What you did, it transcends this competition. Do you understand that?" She shook her head slightly. She didn't, not really. "This show," he continued, "it's a game. It's about votes and popularity and singing cover songs. What you do, it's not a game. It's art. I'm not just giving you a yes to the next round. I'm telling you that you have a career, right now, today, if you want it. That sound your sound, there is an audience for it. A big one." He leaned closer. "I want you to think about something. I don't want you to just go through the motions of this competition, playing what they tell you to play. I want you to use this platform your way. Every time you come out, I want you to speak in that language you invented up there. Can you do that? Will you promise me that?" It felt like a weight being placed on her, but a good weight. A solid one. She thought of the producer telling her to be sweet and simple. She looked at Lucas's intense face, at the other judges nodding in agreement. "Yes," she said, her voice firmer now. "I can do that." "Good," Lucas said, a real smile finally breaking through. "Then this is going to be very interesting." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The train ride back to her town the next day was the opposite of the journey there. Going to the city, everything had been a tight coil of anxiety. Now she felt spaced out, peaceful, like she was floating. She watched the gray industrial outskirts give way to green fields, her forehead resting against the cool glass of the window. Her phone, which had been a quiet, cheap thing, had blown up. Dozens of messages from friends, from people at the auto shop, from distant relatives she hadn't heard from in years. A news article from the local paper had already been shared 100 times. Clocktown girl stuns national TV judges. But it wasn't the messages that stayed with her. It was the quiet, the memory of the silence after she finished playing. That had meant more than all the noise that followed. She got off at her small station. The evening air was cool, smelling of cut grass and distant rain. She walked the familiar streets, past the shuttered shops and the park where kids were playing. Everything looked the same, but she felt completely different. She was a secret that had been told. When she pushed open the front door of her mother's house, the smell of home-stewed tomatoes and furniture polish hit her. Her mother was waiting in the hallway. She didn't say a word. Her eyes were red from crying. She just opened her arms. Maria walked into them, and they held each other tight for a long, long time. Later, after her mother had made her eat 2 bowls of soup, Maria went into the front room. The old upright piano stood in its corner by the window, quiet and patient. The sheet music for the simple folk tune was still open on the stand. She sat on the bench. It creaked familiarly. She didn't play. She just rested her fingers on the keys, feeling their slight stickiness, the tiny chips on the edges. She thought about the grand piano on the stage, its perfect, powerful sound. She thought about the judges' faces, the roar of the crowd. Then she looked at the photograph of her grandfather, now framed and sitting on top of the piano. His kind, knowing eyes. This was her piano. This was where it started. This was the instrument that had listened to her for years, that had let her find her voice, however messy and strange it was. The grand piano on TV had just given that voice a bigger room to shout in. She played a single chord. The sound was softer, warmer, less perfect than the one on stage. It filled the small front room, mixing with the sound of the clock ticking in the hallway and her mother washing dishes in the kitchen. She smiled. She had left the judges stunned on a stage. But here, in this quiet room, was where the music lived. It always had been. The world just didn't know it until last night thought the competition wasn't over. There would be more rounds, more songs, more bright lights. Lucas, the executive, had promised it would be interesting. She believed him, but as she sat there, letting the simple chord fade into the comfortable silence of her home, she knew the real work wasn't about winning a TV show. It was about remembering this feeling, the feeling of being alone with the music in her head and letting it out, honestly, for no one else but the memory of a man who gave her a piano and the girl she used to be. She played the first few notes of the simple tune. Then she stopped. She didn't need to explode tonight. The storm was resting. She had said what she needed to say. For now, it was enough just to be home.